Hello and welcome to Moneylife. This time I'm going to talk about the appointment of the SEBI chairman. He's called the market watchdog, and it's one of the most powerful regulatory appointments in the country. And given the fact that SEBI is one of the most powerful securities market regulators in the world in terms of the kind of powers it has, it can tell you how important this post is. Now, the starting point is that Ajay Tyagi, who is the present chairman, is about to complete the extension that he got of 3 months. In a couple of months, it's going to end. And a very provocative tweet by Dr. Subramaniam Swamy, Member of Parliament, seems to suggest that there is a lot of ugly lobbying that's going on, including by someone close to a former finance minister. Now, we don't know whether that's true in this case, but it is more than possible, because if you look at the really ugly machinations that go on in choosing a SEBI chairman and the manner in which people who have not even been on the final list have got selected, we have reason to believe that it's possible. Now, Mr. Ajay Tyagi's appointment was fairly non-controversial. He's kept a very low profile, has never given an interview, a bit like the Prime Minister, but he also had an incident. He was appointed for 5 years. It was reduced to 3. Those 3 years were complete in February this year. We were almost in the middle of a lockdown. There's a small extension which is also getting over, which is why this has triggered the lobbying. Now, I believe that if this government chooses to follow the process that has been put in place, following a Supreme Court order and several public interest litigations, then the selection committee and ultimately the Prime Minister, who's going to sign off on this appointment, probably need to read 2 books which have come out just in time for this. One is by Mr. UK Sinha in 2019. He was Mr. Tyagi's immediate predecessor. He's waited for 3 years to write this book. It is called Going Public. And just a year before, there's another book written by Mr. Bajpai in 2018, 10 years after he demitted office. He was there for 3 years and Mr. UK Sinha was there for 6 years. In fact, second longest appointment. To understand, I'm not saying that the books bring out things. In fact, what the books don't talk about is probably more important than what they write. So let's start with Mr. UK Sinha's book because it's more recent. It's called Going Public, My Time at SEBI. So what is he going public about? If you ask me, the centerpiece of this book is the absolutely ugly situation that he faced for 3 years when unusually there were 5 public interest litigations filed against him, out of which one was by 3 really eminent people, a super cop, a former air vice marshal and a former CBI chief. What did they say? That the appointments rules were manipulated, that the appointment was malified, that there was an attempt to get him in because there were some industry houses that had to be protected. This was written by a whole-time member of SEBI. So after he was appointed, the petitions were filed to shake him off his job. Now, there's a context over here. 3 of those petitions were withdrawn. There was 2 more that were filed. It ultimately ended with a really hard-hitting Supreme Court ruling. Very, very eminent lawyers took this up, and there were absolutely ugly depositions, charges, counter charges and filings. It is worth looking at. In fact, we've given you a link to the Supreme Court judgment. Those of you who have time need to take a look at it. So, has Mr. Sinha written about all of this? Actually, strangely, no. While he's going public, he's been rather timid about whom he names, does not want to name his predecessor. In fact, Moneylife has written a far more hard-hitting article. Here's the link again, which you need to read because we name names unlike Mr. UK Sinha. But what his book does is it creates a formal public record of the dubious activities that go into appointing the watchdog. And that tells you why, after over 25 years since SEBI has got its statutory teeth, it does not enjoy investor confidence. And enjoying investor confidence, redressing grievances, keeping investors' money safe is a little different ballgame from bringing in rules and doing investor education. Those of you who read Moneylife regularly know that. So let's start with what Mr. Sinha says about his predecessor, CB Bhave. He says when Mr. Bhave was appointed, that itself was very unusual. So Mr. Bhave was the chairman before UK Sinha. He had a case going on, an inquiry when he used to be chairman of the National Securities Depository Limited. The inquiry was being conducted by SEBI. But in this whole big country with a lot of good people, the government apparently decided that he alone was fit for the job. He appeared before the appointments committee, said he is not interested because there's a case going on, but he is again chosen when he is not in the final shortlist. So what do you do about a chairman who has an inquiry going on against him and who's fighting it before the appellate tribunal? So they came up with the idea of ring fencing it. Now, SEBI had also had a committee of its board of directors to be looking into it. This comprised 3 of the directors who formed the committee. They came out while Mr. Bhave was chairman, ring-fenced, apparently not looking at NSDL. They came up with a hard-hitting order which sort of indicted NSDL. Not sort of, it did indict NSDL. So what happens? The board gets together, buries that order, humiliates the board members. One of them has finished his term, the other is insulted, and he quits. The one who quits is Mr. Madan Gopal, a very, very eminent jurist with long years of teaching at Harvard, headed the National Judicial Academy, and he went public, he wrote about it, Moneylife has written about it. In fact, even Justice Verma, one of the most regarded Chief Justices of the Supreme Court, wrote an article defending what Mr. Madan Gopal has to say. None of this made a difference. There's another angle to it, which is this, that as soon as Mr. Bhave was appointed, he and 2 other whole-time directors who had sort of parallel tenures were told that their tenures could go up to 5 years. So obviously at the end of 3 years, none of them expected to quit because they expected that automatically they would have a 5-year tenure. This did not happen for various reasons. One of the most important ones was this order by Mr. Madan Gopal, which they had tried very, very hard to bury and tried hard to ensure that it doesn't even come out in the media. But there is a public interest litigation. Believe it or not, a litigation filed in the Supreme Court by none other than the head of the former Judicial Academy, as Mr. Sinha says in his book, is still pending, going nowhere. Okay? So Mr. Sinha, in his first 3 years, faced 5 public interest litigations. The 5th one ended in a really hard-hitting order where the Supreme Court even said that the petitioners were virtually acting as a stooge for somebody. Some of these remarks were later expunged at their own request. But that is how bad things were in the first year. Mr. Sinha puts a few more things on record. For instance, he says that when Bhave was appointed, other than the ring fencing, apparently the Prime Minister was so unhappy with having to sign the order that he took the unusual step of putting out a detailed explanation to the appointments committee saying Mr. Damodaran has done a good job, he probably deserved the extension, but the finance minister, and that's why we say the buck stops there, did not want him appointed, and that is why Mr. Bhave got the job. Is this how you appoint SEBI chairman, and is this how you build confidence in an organization? Well, obviously it's something that is so upsetting that it's part of the book going public. But that's just one part. Mr. Sinha was there for 6 years. The important thing about that book, strangely enough, is what he doesn't write about. So if you believe in the thin book that he's written about 175 or 80 pages, this is the centerpiece. The other big discussion that he has is about how SEBI vanquished the Sahara Empire and Sahara Parivar. Well, they did do a good job. In fact, Advocate Arvind Datar really fought very hard. We know how much of homework he did personally. Hardly any mention about that. Every SEBI chairman takes credit for what he does. So Sahara and these money circulation and collective investment schemes are the next big thing that the SEBI chairman writes about. Funnily, he got charge of it in 2014 after an amendment. So it was not even the core of what SEBI does. Sahara itself was not under SEBI regulation. It was vaguely under RBI, but for the fact that it came to SEBI for some permissions to list a couple of bonds in 2 group companies, and KM Abraham decided, the nemesis of Mr. UK Sinha, decided to write an order which sort of raised questions about their disclosures. That is what got SEBI into the war against Sahara. It carried on. SEBI did a great job. Part of the problem also was Subrata Roy's own sort of harakiri, if you ask me, because he used to issue full page ads. He even issued a full page ad across the country in every newspaper, English and language, where he actually had the temerity to call SEBI a Sarkari Gunda. Now, somebody who does that is asking for trouble. He got into trouble, went into jail, and had to pay up thousands of crores. Is this the core of SEBI's job, or is it regulating exchanges, brokers? If you read Mr. Sinha's book, you would think collective investment schemes is what the regulator has been set up for. Does that tell you what kind of faulty understanding there is about their regulatory role itself? And the National Stock Exchange, the big ugly fight between exchanges, the rise and fall of Jignesh Shah, none of that even has a mention in the book. Stunning, isn't it? My years with SEBI, it says. Now let's go on to Mr. G.N. Bajpai's book. G.N. Bajpai makes himself the hero of this book, and Mr. J.N. Bajpai's book is called A Game Changer's Memoir. SEBI has not got so transformed after his 3-year tenure. It is true that Mr. Bajpai was affable, open, did a few good things, brought in a lot of best practices from abroad. So let me read some of them. He introduced T+2 settlements. He wanted to make it T+1. This involved forcing the Reserve Bank of India to improve its systems, get in place RTGS to transfer money. So a lot of good stuff had happened. Mr. Bajpai also took over just after the Ketan Parikh scam. There was a joint parliamentary committee. That's why an amendment to the SEBI Act was not so difficult. A whole backing, when you've had a second big scandal in less than 10 years, the entire Parliament and the Finance Ministry backs the things that you want to do. So many of the things that he wanted were quickly accepted, and he was able to do things. It's a well-written book full of stories where he talks about the things. He's the center of the book, the hero, and every single thing is portrayed as his thinking and his vision alone. Those of us who have covered the market for 30 years know that it's no such thing. But SEBI is a chairman-led organization. The chairman can't take credit. He also has to take the blame for things that went wrong. So let me narrate the good practices that he brought in. Like I told you, the T+2 settlement, getting regional exchanges to begin to close down. In fact, one of the big descriptions there is that 23 exchanges which had no chance of surviving after the National Stock Exchange became the number one exchange and had a single screen that could be accessed from around the country. I think the fact that regional exchanges cannot survive was a given. But years and years and plenty of money was wasted in all kinds of things, including starting new exchanges. One was called the Interconnected Exchange. There were something called the Indonext platform. Nothing worked. Mr. Bajpai spent a lot of time with an identity called MAPIN, which had biometrics required for a unique identity. Created a lot of anger. In fact, even today, Aadhaar itself is controversial, and there are questions about privacy and who can access it. Without any of this discussion and thinking, SEBI had tried to do it, caused endless harassment, there was a lot of cost involved, and it was finally discarded. The Central Listing Authority was something that he tried with. Yes, there were 23 exchanges, but they were not national. The national exchanges were just 2, NSE and BSE. And the other creations that they had, OTCEI, which was immaterial, and the interconnected exchanges. But he wanted a central listing authority with common rules. It was pointless, a lot of people against it, but nobody talks openly to the SEBI chairman. He spins that also as an idea ahead of its time. But I'd mention this not because it's relevant, but because of the amount of time wasted on this. There's also a real-time intermarket surveillance system that he launched, which is fantastic. A lot of fanfare. We were very hyped about it. We thought that people are going to be caught within seconds after they join together to do manipulative trades. So many years later, even after a new system was brought in by Mr. Bhave, Rampant manipulation, especially of penny stocks, continues. So we don't know what this does. Does it do only post-facto investigation instead of real-time checking? Nobody has an idea. But it's another example of wasted time with questionable benefits, but who's asking the questions, right? Another good thing was a corporate filing system. He decided to choose something called EDGAR, which was like what the SEC has outsourced in the US, called EDGAR. Great idea, except badly executed, not properly accessible, which stumbled, which was resisted by companies, which is necessary even today. It's required, it should work well, but it was discarded. There is supposed to be a corporate filing system of sorts, which is now run by the NSE and BSE. We don't know who was against EDGAR, but it dragged on, lots of money spent, lots of time wasted, and then finally killed. So in fact, Mr. Bajpai's book is about the amount of time that regulatory organizations waste on everything other than their core job, which is to keep markets safe, which is to be ahead of manipulators. You've had so many issues in the last few years. If the regulator was not, dissipating its energies on a lot of other red tape and creating issues which are not required, then the regulator would be doing a far better job at protecting investors, protecting even mutual fund investors who are so angry with, for instance, what's happened in Franklin Templeton, what happened with Z, what happened with Reliance and the Anil Ambani group. But every time SEBI is behind the curve with all the powers that it has at its credit. Bajpai's book has, like UK Sinha, another absolutely mystifying and stunning fact. Does not talk about exchanges. Other than the introduction of T+1, ugly competition between exchanges, regulatory capture is what led to the huge high frequency trading scam, the one where NSE at its arrogant worst had sued Moneylife, filed a 100 crore defamation case which they lost, which they withdrew in fact, and none of this which happened in UK Sinha's time. He writes a book about his 3 years, none of this figures. Now, if you're going to choose the next SEBI chairman, are you going to ask them, what do you see as your core role? Is it collective investment schemes? Is it some control over stock exchanges? Is it preventing market manipulation? Is it getting out of the clutches of powerful mutual funds and regulators, first line regulators like the NSE? If you don't have someone who's powerful, you're not going to go anywhere. And remember, all this lobbying is not for nothing. There is a reason. When you lobby, when somebody appoints you as the chairman, it is not a title. It is not an honor. It is a job that you're appointed to, the job of a market watchdog. And when there are favors attached to their job, when there is manipulation, arm twisting, and worse, then you have to reciprocate. There's a quid pro quo. And that is why it is so imperative for us as a country to have a chairman who does not have people backing him like this. We have to choose the best man or woman for the job. We do not need this ugly lobby. Thank you.